Howdy folks, this is Big Sam. Welcome back to Mosin Markings. Today we're looking at a pretty common yet pretty interesting one that I think a lot of people don't realize exactly what it means. So today we're going to be focusing on this infamous box with a slash through it. Now, first of all, on a rarity scale, this is probably about a 2 out of 10 on the rarity scale. This is not a very rare marking. Well, what this marking indicates is actually a just sort of a general refurbishment marking, okay? If you see this marking, it indicates that the rifle went through a refurbishment. Now, specifically, this marking is actually from refurbishment arsenal number 1. The Soviets had a lot of different refurbishment arsenals, and they had different numbers associated with them. This one would be referred to as arsenal number 1. Now, this was in the town of, or the district of Balakleya, and I've heard both reports. I've heard it both ways. I've heard it's in Russia, and I've also heard it's in the Ukraine. If you just search that name, you will mostly just get Ukrainian results. So I've heard it both ways. But whatever the case, this was in Balakleya, and again, you're going to see this marking on a lot of guns. Now, in particular, this rifle we're looking at here is a Mosin 9130, which I will show you here. Yep, that's a 9130. And a lot of times you'll see this marking on the right side of the back of the stock like we have here on this rifle. And again, this denotes a refurbishment. Now, before we get into it a little bit more, there's really two different types of refurbishment markings, generally speaking. There's the pre-war or wartime, and then there's the post-war. And specifically with the post-war ones, generally after the late 1940s or early 1950s, they really started using just shapes to denote refurbishment markings for specific depots. Whereas before that, you could actually see numbers. Maybe you've seen the infamous MO marking with a date. We'll talk about that one another day. There's also some other ones we'll look at that were much earlier than this one. So this marking, when you see this, generally this is think at least the 1950s, but could go all the way up to, maybe even the 1980s or even later than that. So this is a pretty common marking because it seems like it was used for a very long time. Now, I said this was a refurbishment marking, and this particular marking, this box with a slash through it, can actually indicate a couple of things. So Arsenal number 1, when they conducted refurbishments, they did a few things. So sometimes they could refinish or re-lacquer coat a stock, and sometimes they would actually fit a brand new stock to the rifle, and apparently they actually produced a lot of new stocks. Now, based on what we can see from this stock, we have these later pattern escutcheons here. And we don't see any type of cartouche or anything back here. Now, that could have been worn off, but from everything I'm seeing here, all the indications point to the fact that this particular stock was actually produced by Depot number 1 at Balakleya. Okay, now sometimes you will see this overstamped back here or next to the original cartouche from one of the manufacturers, either the Izhevsk or the Tula factory. And sometimes you'll also see this stamp on a rifle with an earlier pattern escutcheon. Now, specifically, if you see this marking on an earlier stock that has the escutcheon back here that has these 2 small screws, one on each side, that's probably a good indication that Depot number 1 did not, in fact, manufacture that stock, but rather just refurbished that stock. Generally, when you see the later stocks that were produced, especially after the war, they're not going to be the earlier type pattern. They're generally going to be this pattern that we see here. But remember, there's an exception to every rule with Mosins, and a lot of people may not realize this, but this escutcheon pattern actually was developed by the Tula factory in as early as 1943. So this isn't always a post-war pattern escutcheon, which it's sometimes erroneously referred to as, but for good reason, because the vast majority of times you see this pattern escutcheon, it's a stock that was made post-war and very likely by one of the refurbishment depots, and in this case, depot number 1. Now, how do you remember this marking is for depot number 1? Well, I just remember there's 1 slash in it, 1/1. It seems pretty straightforward to me. But again, this isn't a super rare marking, but it's pretty popular, and this is one of the main things we want to do with this series is just to help give a little bit more insight and exposure to these really common Mosin markings that many people may just not realize what are. And hopefully we did that for you today. Now, you won't always see this just on the stock. You can sometimes see this even like on the barrel shank. The barrel shank is pretty common to see refurbishment markings. This particular rifle actually has a refurbishment marking from a different depot, which we'll talk about another day. But you can also find markings like this, or very similar to this marking from Arsenal number 1, on other rifles besides 9130 rifles. In fact, I'm pretty sure I've seen this exact marking before on a Russian SKS rifle. Right? So Mosins weren't just the only things getting refurbished by these arsenals. I mean, in fact, you would also have things like Nagant revolvers and later weapons such as SKSs, and maybe even things like SVT-40 rifles. Who knows? So a lot of different interesting rifles and weapons in general went through these processes. And again, because it's SKS rifles, we know it wasn't just wartime rifles, but there's a lot of wartime rifles that had to go through these refurbishment steps because a lot of them needed new stocks, right? And again, this took place over the course of, many years, many decades, in fact. And part of the reason is because, well, there's millions and millions of rifles in the Soviets' inventory by the time World War I ended, and it probably took a while to actually go through the cycle of going through all of the weapons in their entire inventory, because they had millions of the things. And even if you had all the weapons at the depot already, you're not going to get through all those in, a month or probably even a year, maybe. But they didn't, right? It took time to even go find all the weapons and say, okay, these guys over in this district have these weapons. They need to get those guys, have them sent over here for repairs and refurbishment. It took a while, folks. So that's why it took, over the course of several decades, you'll see these markings. World War II was a bit of a mess, but hopefully you guys found this video interesting. And if you like taking a look at cool Mosin markings like this one, please make sure to like this video, subscribe, hit the bell, and share the show with your friends. Because all we do here on this channel is Mosin stuff. So thank you guys for watching. Let me know if y'all have any prayer requests. And we'll see you next time.